one that would allow me to prosper. And that drew me across the pond to the UK as a academic and a consultant at PwC, but also it put me into the Middle East, actually leading an $11.5 billion joint venture between Sumitomo Chemicals and Saudi Aramco. Ultimately, I landed in Australia, leading the People Advisory Services practice at Ernst & Young. But one of the critical pieces that propelled me to go to Australia is because for once, I would be looked upon as being an American versus being Black. And that was quickly put to bed when I was driving my car, which at the time was a convertible, and I was stopped by police. And the police took my license, went back to the car, came back to me and said, "I'm not used to seeing people like you driving cars like this who aren't in the drug trade." And that prompted me to think, wherever I am, whatever I'm doing, I will still be perceived as being Black. I won't tell you the exact words my mom used once I got my first Ph.D., but she said, "You may have a Ph.D., but you're still Black." And I think that kind of gets to what I want to talk to you about today, because we've been doing this for a long time. This is not a new initiative. The idea of diversity, equity, inclusion isn't something that just started last year. We've actually gained prominence during the civil rights movement in the late American 1950s and 1960s. And diversity, equity, inclusion in the 21st century has become a defining aspiration for social justice and of conscious enterprises. That doesn't mean it's been smooth sailing. Contrary to the affirmative action programs of the past, today's progressive enterprises are seeking to leverage the unrealized value of difference. But for nearly 3/4 of a century, the journey to change an entire culture and social ecosystem has been celebrated by moments of inspiring success, shocked by unimaginable tragedy, and set back by the reality of having to start again. But I think the conversation changed in 2020 when the world was transfixed by a video capturing the brutal murder of George Floyd by 4 uniformed police officers. It wasn't the first and only video in recent years portraying overzealous and deadly violence against Black and brown people. It did, however, illustrate a disregard for dignity, humanity, and civil rights of people of color. Almost 30 years after Rodney King was senselessly beaten by police in 1992, the culmination of a body cam and random bystander videos reached another social injustice crescendo. Just as before, the moments arrested in living color portrayed the systematic vestiges of racially motivated violence, intolerance of differences, and cultural polarization that remains endemic across the American landscape. As a result, the reemergence of DEI under the guise of social justice imperative, hyper-motivated corporate and philanthropic boards, executive leadership teams, and whole of organizations to look at themselves through a much more critical and wider lens. But I think companies fail to realize through this lens that old system produce the same old results. So well-intended DEI programs aimed at adding diversity to key leadership positions often go one and done. Much like college basketball superstars that enter and exit university programs for a year only to declare for the NBA draft in the next, companies without a viable succession plan to build a sustainable pipeline of differences end up just where they began. When the CEO looks around the leadership table and everyone looking back looks the same, it's too late for the pot to call the kettle black. Privilege embedded in institutional ecosystems will likely only reap privileged returns. New systems built and continuously improved to ensure equity and transparency more often reflect intended future aspirations. Now, from my perspective, DEI describes a culture change ethos that's galvanized by training, practices, and programs that build organizational awareness and capability to promote representation and participation of different individuals and groups based on, but not limited to, age, race, ethnicity, ability, disability, gender, religion, culture, and sexual orientation. However, change is no longer an adequate response to an enterprise-wide approach to taking responsibility for culture and social justice in places where people work and the communities in which they live. Changing employee value proposition and evolving cultural norms requires transformative capability to fully realize the value of a multicultural, multi-generational, and multi-enabled workforce. In a modern culture and social ecosystem, DEI must be embraced as a relentless pursuit of transformation, a holistic, enterprise-wide approach to continuously improve through readiness, capability, and execution. As an intended outcome, transformation embeds adoption, innovation, and disruption into organizational muscle memory to create and sustain competitive workforce advantage. So the goal of transforming diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace is threefold to my mind: measure and validate how differences are valued, deconstruct institutional systems, processes, and practices of inequalities in which differences consist, and then rebuild organization culture to accept inclusion and integrate belonging. So over the past 2 decades, 3 primary roles have emerged along a transformation value chain, which I describe as a baseline along which to assess the expected value and positioning of DEI compared to actual cultural impact and outcomes. These roles include new entrant, business partner, and strategic disruptor. Now, new entrants are tasked with value maintenance and cost compliance. Business partners are likely to be value adding, but cost-centered. And in the most progressive, culturally and commercially outcome-focused organizations, the role of strategic disruptor, more commonly known as Chief Diversity Officer, is around value creating and profit-centered. So while many diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives start out with a bang, they can end up in a quiet whimper. The demise of these initiatives isn't for lack of trying. The reality is DEI often sits among a crowded list of strategic priorities. So even with the best laid plans, transformation can stall until the enterprise is ready to take off. Transforming diversity, equity, inclusion is not a destination or an end state. It is instead a purpose-led journey that continuously builds transformative capability and fosters a readiness mindset to execute an enterprise-wide strategic diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. Good DEI intentions only go so far and can easily be replaced by the next big thing unless a shared purpose is embedded into the development of competence, mindset, and delivery of expected cultural and commercial outcomes. So to keep DEI transformation atop the strategic priorities, I'm going to give you 5 steps for transforming DEI. The first one is around this notion of purpose. Every journey starts with purpose. While the rationale to transform DEI may start with a directive from the board, the why must live and breathe in the hearts and minds of the entire enterprise. Without the why, the journey to engage and realize expected DEI outcomes never really begins. And this should start with a whole of business conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion. You need to define and communicate a shared purpose that reflects the enterprise why. You need to embed that shared purpose into every enterprise DEI initiative so that language, effort, and outcome becomes part of, not separate from, business as usual. Second, what gets measured gets transformed. Most HR functions know the talent they've acquired, but what they don't know is likely far more valuable. So if difference matters, and increasingly leaders stand by the mantra that people are their greatest asset, there are a lot of assets still left on the table. So it's really important to collect granular data across the enterprise to identify and celebrate people's whole self and recognize and acknowledge the value of differences. They need to then use that data to set evidence-based policies, practices, and develop informed practical application. They need to monitor data trends to provide insights and validate transformation impact. Third, when bad habits prevent good outcomes, bad habits tend to be embedded into the institutional systems, and they will inevitably reap bad outcomes. Until leaders acknowledge system inequalities and bias only benefit a limited few, DEI outcomes stemming from equity and transparency are unlikely to flourish. So what we need to do is figure out how to conduct an external audit of systems, processes, and practices to measure and benchmark equity, transparency, and innovation against DEI outcomes. We need to be able to assess and remove systems that obstruct equity, transparency, and innovation, and then rebuild systems, processes, and practices to ensure DEI-based integrity. 4, we need to break up to make up. So if enterprises aspire to become truly inclusive, they may need to break up with their current culture to transform into a culture yet to be defined. Leaders must commit to disrupting today's business as usual to reshape the future in a new image. Educate and credential those accountable for leading DEI transformation initiatives to ensure capability and competence support goals and objectives. And engage the whole of business in the transformation journey, not only to confirm the current state, but also agree to own a part of reshaping its future. There needs to be an immersion of the enterprise into multi-platform transformation initiatives, including culture, talent acquisition, performance, a digital platform, and communication. And lastly, 5, there are no happy DEI accidents. Transforming diversity, equity, and inclusion is purposeful and deliberate. Much more than wishful thinking, valuing diversity of difference doesn't happen by mistake. Senior leaders don't accidentally acknowledge institutional inequalities, discard and replace them with transparent systems of equity. Inclusive cultures of belonging don't miraculously appear from one day to the next by happenstance. For DEI to be fully realized, culture must be transformative as it is disruptive. If 75 years of social justice and civil rights history is any guide, incremental change can seem painfully underwhelming. But for every corporate board, executive leadership team, and enterprise aspiring to accelerate the pace of strategic disruption, building transformative capability, and executing DEI outcomes will be no accident. Now, I guess what I'd like to do is take this opportunity to give you 2 things. One is in the chat, there will be a link to a survey that focuses on how your organization is functioning currently in its DEI efforts and initiatives. And the idea is for you to be able to put this data in. It's kind of a health check and get a report back that allows you to see the group that is on screen now, where you are positioned in your DEI efforts. I think it'll be an interesting opportunity just to see where you are as we talk a lot about DEI, and what we do may look good on a piece of paper or on a picture when you walk into the office. But what we're talking about is how and to what extent have you embedded those practices, policies, and procedures into the fabric of the culture, and an opportunity to get towards an inclusive culture. And I guess the second thing I want to do is to answer any questions that you have about anything that I've said thus far. Yeah, Jose's got the link.
Quick question. Is there a slide deck that accompanies your session that we're not seeing?
There was, but I've gone for the slimmed down version of my talk because we were having some technical difficulties.
Is there any way for us to get a copy of those slides?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you.
I'd be really disappointed if there are no questions. I threw a lot out to you. Either you heard me and agree, or you're in violent disagreement and too shy to tell me about it. Go ahead.
I have a quick question. So I love that the entire presentation is beautiful, and I hope we can get a transcript of it so we can quote it and share it. It's just beautiful. You mentioned measuring and benchmarks, which I thought that was super cool. And there's so many assessments out there. Do you have a favorite, or maybe one or two? Do you have an opinion on the IDI? So that's kind of the realm of my question.
Yeah, selfishly, we've developed a measure ourselves. So the organization that I represent, Diversity Atlas, part of what we do is actually assess organizations' data, human capital data, along 4 principles. And in fact, when you do the survey, you'll begin to see what they are. I think what organizations tend to do, I guess, on a number of spectrums. One is organizations tend not to collect the type of data that is vastly representative of the organization. It might take a slice of the organization, but it doesn't give a full picture. And so when we talk about differences, we tend to have a very small set of differences and not representative of the vast majority of what those differences are. So we look at not only sexual orientation and religion and race and ethnicity, but we look at, for example, your native language and the language of your parents. We were talking to one of the representatives from the UN in Switzerland, and we gave her the link, and she looked on there, and she was really surprised to see of the 8,500 languages, the particular language in her village, which she was a part of in Africa, was identified. And what was so unique about that is that language was actually brought in from another part of Africa, but it was represented in our survey. So, I think, everything from payroll data all the way to the type of data we're talking about gives organizations an opportunity to get a much more robust understanding of who's in the organization and how we can utilize that difference to serve both our cultural and commercial differences.
Thank you.
Question on number 0.3 about bad habits.
Yes.
How do you make this work if you're going to not make DEI training compulsory?
So I think we tend to start from, that's a great question. I think we tend to start from the wrong part of the argument. In the work that I've done in many organizations around the world, what they tend to do is focus on a nice to have. And when you mandate training from a nice to have perspective, what they get out of it is different than if it were from an opportunity to do something that they wanted to do, that they signed up to do, from both a cultural and commercial perspectives. So we're running a masterclass, for example, and it's only focused on board level and executive level participants. because the people that are more likely to participate in the training you talk about, for example, tend to be people who are not in possession of authority. They don't have budgets, and they're not in the habit of making decisions. And so while we may have a layer of people who are very excited to take part in training, in terms of that getting to the people who actually make decisions about an organization moving from point A to point B, we get a lot of people in the middle who can't necessarily make that call. So again, I think on two fronts: one, the idea of a shared purpose means everybody in the organization has an opportunity to get on the bus or get off. And two, the opportunity to look at it from a commercial perspective. There has to be a value, both in terms of our culture and transforming the culture, but also CEOs and board need to see what the commercial value is. And I think we've typically done a very poor job of linking those two, which are very much linked together. We just haven't been able to identify that in the same way that we've talked about diversity, equity, inclusion. More questions, please. I've traveled from Australia, so I really want to get a couple more questions in before I head back home tomorrow. Emily.
Hi, Wesley. I work for an organization with about 160 employees, and our DE&I efforts are emphasized through our employee resource groups. We have some enthusiasts and champions throughout the organization, but oftentimes these efforts are kind of put on the back burner due to competing priorities. And despite a very emphatic want to accomplish these things, what is some advice that you might have for an organization our size? What can we do to help champion that?
Yeah, great question, Emily. I think the good news is that you're a very small organization, comparatively speaking, and the likelihood of, both figuratively and literally getting everybody in a room to have a conversation is more than likely to take place, easier than larger organizations or even global organizations. I think the first and most important thing is to talk about why, and talk about the why from a enterprise-wide perspective. To your point around having pockets of interest and enthusiasm doesn't necessarily mean an entire organization can leverage that to change, and definitely not to transform. So my first kind of piece would be, how can we identify a whole of organization why that identifies why we're doing it, what the purpose is, and what my role is going to be, me as in one of the people within the organization going to be, and to what extent are leaders involved in being the champion to leading this process. And I agree wholeheartedly with the previous speaker. This is not an HR piece. This is a whole of organization effort. If you look at the amount of resource that organizations put into research and development to identify new projects, or put into ensuring that their accounting systems are up to snuff, it needs to take on that same type of purpose and purposefulness, and have a deliberate outcome focused. We tend to go into these programs thinking we'll do this, we'll do that, but we haven't identified some specific measures or metrics. And also what I like to talk about is cultural KPIs. So we haven't identified, we've identified commercial KPIs, but we haven't identified cultural KPIs that allows us to say, everything from, we're going to identify a different mix of gender balance within the organization. We want to be an employer of choice, and we're able to identify the number of people that have hit our website or have identified their willingness to be part of a talent pool or whatever, but some very specific metrics that allow us to connect our efforts from a DEI perspective to some very specific outcomes, again, that cross over into commercial as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Wesley.
Sure. More questions, please. Any other questions?
It may be difficult for you to see hands.
Oh, there we go. I'm sorry.
I
Yes.
see Marjalam. I think she had her hand up before
Sure.
I did.
Sure, I'm sorry. Marceline, go ahead, please. I think you're on mute. I think you're still on mute. Third time's the charm. Marceline, you okay? Looks like you're looking for the mute button. It's in the bottom left-hand corner typically, and it would have a cross over it, a red cross from top right to bottom left. Marceline, why don't you put something in the chat and I can get it from there.
It seems like my technology is working a little bit better. If you'd like, I'd be happy to go first, and then Marjalam can
Why don't
come
you
in.
jump in, Rich, while she puts it in the chat or gets to unmute. Go ahead.
Yeah, my pleasure, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. I'm wondering about the size of the company that you feel it may be easiest. I like low-hanging fruit. So I mean, I'm a solopreneur and I only hire people who are neurodivergent. So that makes things, easy for me. Well, no, it does not make things easy for me because it's not easy to recruit people to come on board who have invisible differences. But
Yes.
the point is that there are so many businesses that need to get on board with diversity training, DEI, DEIA, however we look at it, it just has to happen. And my question to you is, will it have to start with the big corporations or how can the smaller companies, the 150, 200, 1,500 employee companies really get on board? And how do we reach those CEOs with the message?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll turn it back around in this way. Size doesn't matter in this context. What matters is how an organization is able to transform itself. And if that's, if you think about companies like GE or Starbucks, companies that are ginormous, organizations like people do what's important to them. And so if it's important for an organization to transform itself and look at DEI as the platform on which they view that transformation to take place, that's what they'll do. I don't know of an organization that really wants to do something that hasn't been able to do it if they have not done something of equal importance before. So I guess the metric to assess isn't size, it's to assess how quickly, how effectively, and how efficiently organizations can transform. And that, if you think about technology, organizations all the time go through technology change, whether that's a platform for payroll or communication or something else. But to the extent that they can move, SAP and have a go live date within 3 months, that's a transformation. So I'd be more apt to look at how they focus on and implement transformation as a measure that's more likely to be replicated in the context of transforming DEI versus anything else. You're ready. Go ahead.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Now, this question may not apply to your topic, but all the same, I'm going to ask it.
Please.
You know, I belong also to a organization, Initiatives of Change. So we are asking a question, you know, there is a big gap, the intergenerational gap. So the values that the elders practice is not relevant today to the young group. So how do you sort of fill this gap? That's my question.
And well worth the wait. It's a really interesting question. I think one of the things that when we go into organizations, we kind of go in with our history in tow. So, you know, I've worked here and there and you've worked somewhere else. And so we tend to look at our experiences not as inclusive as they should be. And in fact, probably look at them exclusively such that they differentiate us from each other and perhaps says more about where we want to be placed in an organization. My experiences may be more relevant than yours or vice versa. But I think this starts with, as I noted, you know, the first thing we need to do is to have a conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion. But to your point, it's more about finding the purpose that allows us to share a purpose. And through that conversation, we're able to bring in all types of values and understandings and leverage what we know and what we want to know and start at that point and build off of that, as opposed to going into this with our own individual experiences and perspectives. There's so much to be learned from people who are coming into the workforce, either from a university degree or from a lived experience. Compare that to someone who's had 20 years in the workforce, perhaps a number of degrees. Those two experiences have equal value. And to the extent that we can talk about them having equal value, then we're away. If we begin to or continue to isolate those experiences and values in isolation, the organization and its trajectory towards transformation will be just that much slower.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else? I can see all hands if you raise them. So the question is, how will DEI ever work when many people cannot bring their whole selves into the respective workplaces? As an African-American woman, I bring a diverse perspective to the workplace, but how diverse is it really? Look, that's a really good question. And I think what I talk about is this idea of effectively deconstructing the current culture. As you know, culture is based on everything from the things you can see, artifacts, things you can't see, beliefs and values. And that creates an environment in which people go about their daily work, whether they pass by something that's wrong and don't correct it, to how people are rewarded, to when people come to work and when they leave. What we don't do well is, again, identify what those differences are and begin to have a conversation of how important they are. So the idea is to deconstruct what we currently have, our current state, and literally reconstruct both the identification of a future state and the pathway to get there. But we have to do that as an organization. So to your point earlier, Rich, around the size of the new organization and the extent to which that's, you know, a quick hit or something much more long-term, it depends on how an organization transforms itself in any other context. This would be the same thing. How quickly do we understand our current state and using data to help validate what that current state is, agree to the future state, and again, within that, be able to identify what individual roles are. We can have a role for people of color. We can have a role for people who are gay and lesbian and other. We can have a role for people who are disabled, but everybody has to make a determination of whether to get on the bus or stay off. And if we're looking at this from a whole of organization perspective, we then allow people to bring their whole selves into that process, create a new culture that is inclusive of all of those differences, that tends not to exclude people on the basis of race, religion, orientation, and the other. Does that answer that question? I think this is kind of the heart of these types of conversations, because in my experience, organizations want to do the right thing. I worked with an insurance company in Australia where I live, and one of the biggest drawbacks for them was, how do we identify resources? What is going to be our DEI strategy? And who's going to take ownership of it? And I won't mention the organization, but what was interesting is, after having a conversation with one of the people in HR, just the conversation about how important this is went from her having 1 day a week focused on DE&I to 2 days a week focusing on DEI. And you may think that's a very small step, but it is in fact a step. The more emphasis that can be placed on DEI, and the more it can link to the organization's success, not separate, but actually inclusive of DEI, the more likely they are to see that this isn't something that we do over there in HR, but something that's led by the leadership team, by the board. And they're accountable, as I said before, for actually metrics, KPIs that help to identify where we are now, but where we need to get to. And that has commercial implications. I worked with a construction company and helped them to develop these types of cultural KPIs, in which their performance, in other words, how they got paid and rewarded, was part of this notion of changing the culture. So identifying those cultural KPIs was no longer something that they just talked about over there. It determined their bonus. It determined how and to what extent they got paid. And when you get to that point, now everybody's on board, because nobody wants to get left behind in terms of not reaching their, financial goals for themselves. But it's the extent to which you put those things together. I think and look, this isn't a new idea, but we really have to embed these cultural KPIs into people's performance, into the organization performance as a whole, and stop looking at it as an individual piece that we put in an annual report that has an asterisk saying, we've been at this for 18 months and we don't expect too much to happen over the next 6 months. I can tell if there's no more air in the room, and we can leave it there. I'd love to keep this conversation going if you will help me.
Somebody dropped another question in the chat.
Oh, right. I don't have my glasses on, so you can probably see it better than I can. Do you have a story of a business you worked with that effectively incorporated lasting DEI? Where I'm sorry, where did that go? Oh, it moved up, sorry. Where did they start and why did it last? Yes. So I won't be able to tell you the name of the organization, but I can tell you, I can talk to about 3 organizations, and only one of them has been successful, and you'll understand why. Let me start out with the organizations that have not done so well. One of the organizations is not doing well because what they've done is they've literally purchased the idea of DEI, but it was done at the behest of HR. And as I noted earlier, to my mind, unless you have authority and responsibility of both budget and decision-making, you're literally pushing doo-doo uphill. And therefore, if people at the top of the business don't see it as having value, again, from a commercial and cultural perspective, it won't get done. Another organization is a gigantic organization. They've had better success, but I think it's still an initiative. And anytime you implement an initiative, as opposed to changing or transforming culture, you run into difficulties of scale, size, and resource. So for example, and I'm not speaking out of school here, I worked with a company called Fonterra, and I implemented a number of culture changes, one of which was to bring more women into leadership roles. And I didn't call it a program or an initiative, because if and when I left the organization, that initiative would have left with me. So instead, I changed how we look at the performance of everyone. And I looked at it from a performance, potential, and length of service perspective. And that unlocked the way we looked at performance, the way we looked at our people. And that allowed us to develop something called available to offer, which meant women in particular, from these measures of potential and performance and length of service, were now recognized. And I increased the number of women in leadership by 28% in less than 2 business cycles. It wasn't a program, it wasn't an initiative. It was changing, again, practices and policies in terms of how we look at people's, again, individual performance and potential. In terms of the one organization that I, again, won't tell you the name of, the reason it worked is because it started from the top. It started from the board actually saying, this is what we wanted to do. The board determined what those metrics of success were. They measured those successes, starting with their current state. And so it was and I don't mean this pejoratively, a trickle down effect, because if it starts at the board and at the senior leadership team, the way in which, to your point earlier around mandating these types of things, it wasn't a mandate to say, I want you to take this training, or I want you to do this or that, the other. The mandate was the purpose of the transformation. It was saying, this is something that we find important to who we are as a business. And therefore, we, the board and the senior leadership team, adopted a way in which to look at differences, to value differences. And I talked earlier about this notion of adoption, innovation, and disruption. They started with adoption, which is this notion of process change. They changed how they did things. They changed how they recruited, how they selected, moving from looking at where people went to school, certain identifiers that if you looked at it, you could tell this person was of color or they came from this background or the other, effectively wiping all that away so that what people were able to look on a resume was who they actually were. They then moved to this idea of innovation. And again, I talk about this as a value change. So they actually did an audit of their systems and processes. In other words, this notion of institutional or systemic, in this case, inequity. And they were able to pull away all of those levers that wouldn't allow them to look away from privilege. And again, if you think about privilege as those people that gain advantage by a systemic practice or policy or perspective, when you take away that privilege, now you create a level playing field. And so innovation is not going to be based on the fact that you're white and went to an Ivy League school. It's going to be based on the fact that you have great ideas. And because you're on a level playing field, your ideas are just as important or equally represented and identified and acknowledged as someone else. So those two things the process change and the innovation change through value change was able to move this organization to success. But again, it started from the top. I think groundswell is really important, but you have to have, and this word may sound strange, but you have to have permission as an organization to adopt these types of, again, not initiatives or programs, but you have to say, this is what we're going to do as an organization. Again, be purposeful, be deliberate, identify where it is that you want to go, identify what the future state looks like. If everyone can agree to that future state and be able to measure the extent to which you're getting there and that trajectory, it's just like a balanced scorecard or any other commercial set of numbers that you get each month. I guarantee organizations know how much money is coming into the organization and how much is leaving every month. But how do we train those same eyes to look at diversity, equity, inclusion? And to the extent we aren't, we're not serious. We're just, putting lipstick on a pig, as they say. If this is something that you're going to do, you have to be serious about it. You have to be purposeful and deliberate. And until you do that, everything else is sea foam and fairy's breath. I would like to hear the stories too. Thanks. Okay, sorry. Any other questions? No, no, but I'll try to read it. Your experience around not creating a program initiative and instead targeting policies and procedures that presented barriers. How did you identify those barriers within policies? Did you encounter resistance to? So it was an audit. It was an institutional systemic audit that allowed us to look at everything from, again, how the organization hired people, how they promoted them, how they rewarded them, to an assessment, an internal assessments and external assessment, of their culture. I was able to use, in one instance, creating values. The organization had previously used an outside organization to identify 4 values. And the organization itself rejected those values. So we did the hard work of identifying through a survey, interviews, and focus groups, what the values of the organization should be. And through that, we were able to use that as our lens to say, if these are the values, what are the, again, diversity, equity, and inclusion, again, practices and policies and procedures that support those values. And then we're able to make the link between kind of what we said and what we did and identify the path forward. So long way around saying you have to have some type of audit, and that audit should include both people from within the organization and some type of external component that allows you to be objective in the information and perspective and insights that can be recommended. Who were the auditors? In other words, from what talent pool can an organization find qualified auditors who will have eyes to see? Auditors, to my mind, again, the principles should be external. So what's important is to have internal people be a part of the process to guide and help understand the nomenclature of the organization, kind of historical context, understand where the organization's been, where it wants to go. But in terms of doing the actual audit, that really needs to be an external auditor. I've worked in a number of professional services companies, and they do this type of work. We do this type of work as well. But I think it's really important to understand, first and foremost, what you're trying to achieve, what the purpose is, and that will guide you towards the organization you choose to conduct the audit, because you may experience some unpleasant truths. And that's happened in our experience where, you get some people who really don't want to stand up and recognize and acknowledge the either the privilege that's embedded in the system, or the potential outcome for failure based on some of those, again, institutional and systemic issues. I think we've got a couple of minutes left, so I'd really like to get a few more questions if you can. I leave tomorrow, Monday, and I don't get home until Wednesday. I'm going to think about all of this opportunity to have you all ask me questions that I would have missed out on if you don't ask them now.
So you talked about credentialing, educating and credentialing individuals within an organization. What's your recommendation for both?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of ways to look at it. There are a number of courses that are offered through higher education institutions. We offer them ourselves. I think it's important to understand why you're getting a credential, who's getting the credential, and for what purpose. I remember, managing a team and literally someone coming to me and saying, "Hey, Wes, I want to take a course in whatever it was." And my question was, how does that relate to or align with your current role or where you want to go in the future? And I think it's important to ask those questions of the people that are, requesting to take some type of course. What do they want to do with it, and what does the organization get out of it? And that's not an unfair question to ask, especially when it comes to DEI. So if they're saying, "I want to take a DEI class," awesome. What are you going to do with it? Is it going to be something that we can implement, something that we can embed into what we do now? Or is it something that you want to put on your resume to, make you more attractive to another organization? The irony of the DEI role is that the tenure of chief diversity officers and the like has gone down over the past few years. So I was just saying the other day, between 2018 and 2021, it's gone from about 3.1 to 1.8 years. And that's, to my mind, simply because what DEI officers or chief diversity officers are being asked to do doesn't align itself to what the organization expects. And so you have a disconnect between, a new enthusiastic CDO and the reality that they come in to an organization that isn't ready for change or transformation. They haven't provided them with the necessary resources. They've only given them a very small budget, but they want to see these big things take place. And so that disconnect leads to disenchantment, and ultimately the CDO leaves. So, thank you. So I think, again, to the extent that the coursework or education and training is focused on what the organization is trying to achieve, again, as a purpose that includes DEI, I think you'll be fine. If it's for some other reason, you probably need to have a different conversation. I've been told I have time for 2 more questions, so I'm really excited to get these 2 great questions to send me off on a plane for the next 36 hours. What are your thoughts in a university setting a DEI course when there are very specific humanities departments majors and also academic having serious? That's a really interesting question. So, yeah, that's a tough one. So, look, I think, in many ways, it's a conversation that has to happen internally before you can develop courses that are offered externally. I was saying here at Penn State, I used to teach a course called Racism and Sexism when I was doing my PhD, that was offered in sociology, women's studies, and African and African American studies. And when it was taught, there were 30 seats available, but there were about 600 students who wanted the course, who wanted to take the course. And after the third year that I offered it, there were over 2,500 students that wanted to take the class. And I didn't get a place for all those students. I got 10 more students. So here's a situation where there were a lot of people who wanted, especially Penn State, which is, I think one of the 6 largest states. It has a history of white supremacy groups across the state. We're in central Pennsylvania, which is about as isolating as I've ever been, coming from the south side of Chicago. And here is a group of students who want to enrich their minds around racism and sexism. And the university wasn't in a position, for whatever reason, to offer students that opportunity. So, very much in the same way, I think, we can talk about it, but until you're ready to move on the dime and say, again, here's authority, here are resources, and here are the outcomes that we want to see happen, you're not serious. And if, you're having internal issues, that just means, not disrespecting any religion or ideas, we need to have a come to Jesus moment, because we're not being serious. So I think I'm getting the high sign that says we're done. There's a lot of whispering going on behind the scenes here. It's been my absolute pleasure to speak with you. I'll ensure to get the words from my presentation and the slides that go with it to Penny in, so that you all can see the intricacies of my thinking. It will be an article that's going to be published as well, so you'll get to see that too. But thanks everyone for having me, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Oh, don't forget, in the chat, there was a survey. That's an opportunity for you to effectively see who's in the room, and the types of questions that it asks, again, is around a DEI health check. And I think that would be illustrative for each of you all to see, how you're positioned amongst your peers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McLendon. So now we're going to take a lunch break for about 25 minutes before we begin the afternoon session. Thank you. Okay.